So welcome to the November lecture in the focal topic, Justice in Sustainability. My name is Bernardo Jurema, and I am part of the coordination team of the Justice focal topic at the Research Institute for Sustainability. This public lecture series is one of the activities carried out in the context of the RIF's 2022-23 focal topic. The public lecture series features different well-established and rising scholars and practitioners in the fields of justice and sustainability. Our aim is to put highly relevant work on different justice dimensions in climate and sustainability politics up for debate, addressing an academic audience as well as the general public. Please check out our website, subscribe to our newsletter, and follow us on Twitter to learn more about our activities. I will link them on the chat. Today, it's my honor to introduce Professor Rodrigo Nunes. Rodrigo is one of the most interesting and original thinkers from Brazil today. He was, until very recently, professor of modern and contemporary philosophy at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. But he has just moved to the UK to take his position as senior lecturer in political theory and organization at the University of Essex. About 2 years ago, his book, Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, A Theory of Political Organization, was published and became an instant classic amongst activist circles. Last year, he published in Portuguese the book do Transe, a Vertigem, Ensaios sobre Bolsonarismo e Mundo em Transição, one of the most insightful studies of the Brazil's far right. So it is with this background that Rodrigo, in the midst of the accelerating climate crisis on a planetary level, increasing military conflicts globally, growing socioeconomic inequality, and the strengthening of the far right, he joins us, our Justice and Sustainability lecture series, to tackle the crucial aspect of how we can respond to all of these intertwined crises. So it's the issue of organizing. That is a central part of the struggle of climate justice, in particular here in the global north, where there are still more democratic openings, even if they are diminishing, but also where we bear a huge degree of responsibility for the very dire situation that we now face. So I pass it over to Rodrigo, and after his presentation, we will have a Q&A session where we will take questions from our audience. So Rodrigo, the floor is yours.
Hi, Bernardo. Hi, everyone. Hi. Okay, maybe this will work now. Maybe if you turn off. Yeah. Hi again. Okay, this time it's okay. So hi Bernardo and everyone. Thank you for coming. It's been a pleasure to get this invitation. We've been trying to arrange this talk since last year. And it finally happened now, although in the end, I'm here in Berlin in Bernardo's kitchen, and we're doing it remotely. But so this is also why I cannot introduce, I understand that the correct Zoom etiquette is that I should introduce the cat to you, but I cannot introduce the cat because I don't know the cat's name. I just arrived here and
Judith.
You did?
Judith.
Okay, Judith. So the topic of my talk today is going to be matters of scale in both the understanding of capitalism and the understanding of the causal powers of capitalism, and things like the fossil fuel industry on the one hand, and on the other hand, the ways in which matters of scale matter for the resistance to or against fossil fuel capitalism, or the fossil fuel industry and capitalism. So the first point in this talk concerns what I call in my book neither vertical nor horizontal, which Bernardo mentioned at the start, the trauma of organization. What I mean by this concept, trauma of organization, is the following. Basically, what we saw in the 20th century was not only a series of defeats of pretty much every attempt to mobilize the collective capacity to act of workers, subalternized groups, etc., in an anti-systemic direction, but a defeat that was all the more bitter because in setting out to produce the liberation of those groups and the liberation of humankind, these attempts had not only failed to overcome capitalism as a world system, but ended up producing different forms of oppression and enslavement in their own right. So this left anyone who, or all of us who went through those experiences, who directly went through those experiences of the 20th century, or grew up hearing about them and reading about them and in contact with the people who'd been through those experiences, this left us with a very clear sense of the extent to which the collective capacity to act could be perverted, which generated a somewhat legitimate, or perfectly legitimate in a sense, desire to either refuse or to minimize the role of an organized collective capacity to act. It always bears remembering that the question made famous by John Holloway's book, In the Turn of the Century, the question of whether it was possible to change the world without taking power, was emerged in the first place because people had gone through the experience of taking power and not changing the world. So that was the experience of, those were the experiences of the 20th century. And this was the trauma they left with us, the trauma of organized collective agency. This instinctive response to the trauma combined very well with the rise of neoliberal hegemony around the same period when people were elaborating this trauma, i.e. in the mid to late 70s and early 80s. As my friend Jeremy Gilbert writes, the unspoken assumption of neoliberal culture, I'm quoting here, is that democracy cannot work because all collectivities are inherently impotent. Or if they are not, i.e. if they're not impotent, then they should be, because the other informing assumption of individualist culture is this: if collectivities are ever capable of exercising agency, then it's only in the form of a monstrous and homogenizing mass, a fascist crowd. End of quote. So collectivity is inert, it doesn't exist, it's inefficient, both causally and in the more economic sense of the word. It is incapable of doing what is expected of it, but if it isn't, then if it isn't inert, if it isn't non-existing, then it should be, because it can only express itself, or it can only realize, it can only materialize itself as a fascist mass. What I call the trauma of organization has two consequences. The first one of which is the erasure of what I call the pharmacological nature of political organization. What I mean by that, obviously, here I'm referring to the Derridian concept of the pharmacon, but actually the Derridian concept is merely exploiting the meaning, the double meaning that is already there in the Greek word pharmakon, something that is at once poison and remedy. What I mean by the pharmacological nature of political organization is that organization is at the same time an enabling condition, a condition of possibility, because organization basically refers to the means we give ourselves to assemble and structure and channel a collective capacity to act. So in that sense, it's an enabling condition. It's a condition of possibility for political action. But on the other hand, it's also something that can be turned against that capacity to act, as the experiences of the 20th century showed us again and again. So what the trauma of organization does is erase that duality, that necessary duality, to the extent that it directs us to think about the problem, to think about organization exclusively as excess and not also as lack. So we worry about the excess of organization. We worry about the ways in which it can be turned against us if there is too much of it, so to speak. But we do not stop to think about the fact that we often are actually experiencing the lack of it, or we're experiencing the fact that we don't have enough of it to do what we believe should be done. And it's obvious why it's much easier to worry about excess than it is about lack, because what the lack of organization, what the lack of a collective capacity to act, the situation that the lack of a collective capacity to act leaves us in, is basically the situation in which we find ourselves every day, the situation of impotence in the face of the world, the situation or a condition of being unable, of being incapable of doing what we believe should be done. So that was the first consequence of the trauma of organization. The second consequence is that it limits the capacity of collective action at scale. And a clear symptom here of the trauma of organization and how it has structured our ways of thinking since the latter half of the 20th century is the substitution that's characteristic of this political theoretical conjuncture that opens at the end or from the mid-70s onwards and becomes fully consolidated in the 80s and 90s. The substitution of the vocabulary of reform and revolution by the vocabulary of local resistances. So suddenly, because we fear organization, or we fear the potential risks of the excess of organization being turned against our own collective capacity to act, we cease to talk about transformation at scale and think only in terms of local resistances to higher powers. obviously, this doesn't mean that people in the 80s and 90s didn't realize, at least implicitly, or didn't recognize, at least implicitly, that local resistances were not sufficient to deal with or to confront dynamics that unfolded at a higher level. So the way in which this restriction of thought and political practice to the local scale was compensated, theoretically, was through the introduction of ideas that were borrowed from scientific discourses on self-organization, complexity, etc., into political discourse. And you all probably remember, this is something that's quite characteristic of 90s and early 2000s political discourse. There's this recourse to scientific discourses on complexity and self-organization. What this recourse was trying to do was precisely to answer the question, how can local resistances that remain exclusively local combine in order to produce global transformations? And the answer was that when complex systems that are ruled by non-linear relations find themselves far from their conditions of equilibrium, local fluctuations can produce a radical transformation of the overall patterns of organization of those systems. Which is true, of course, according to our best science, but this reception of scientific discourse at this time tended in general to neglect two very important details. First of all, the fact that we are not always necessarily in the proximity of a critical threshold, i.e., we're not necessarily always, the social systems in which we exist aren't necessarily always far enough from their condition of equilibrium for those processes through which local fluctuations produce large-scale transformations to take place. And secondly, that the move from local fluctuation to systemic change actually supposes a few concepts in between that were symptomatically ignored in that reception of scientific discourses on self-organization into political thought. I refer here to concepts such as nucleation and critical size. There are different versions of these concepts in different contexts. I'm using here the concepts as they appear in the work of Ilya Prigogine on far from equilibrium systems. Basically, what these two concepts put together, nucleation and critical size, indicate is that in order to be capable of propagating across a system and transforming it, a local fluctuation must not only start from a certain point, i.e., change doesn't start all at once everywhere, it starts from a certain point and propagates from there, but this starting point must be big enough to resist the negative feedback mechanisms of the system that will try to inhibit the change brought by those local fluctuations. In other words, the condition to sustain the hope that small local actions could, at a certain point, come together, combine to produce large-scale global transformations, was a very truncated reading of what the science was actually saying in this regard. And why was that truncated? Well, my hypothesis is precisely that once you bring concepts like nucleation and critical size back into the conversation, you have to talk into a conversation about politics. You would have to talk about such things as collective organized agency at scale, and the recourse to these scientific discourses on self-organization was, and that was precisely what this recourse was trying to get away from. A similar thing happens with discussions around climate change. Climate change is, of course, the greatest problem humankind has ever faced, and it's very much likely that it is an intractable problem, i.e., it's very much likely that we've found a problem that we cannot actually solve. Because on the one hand, to solve it or to confront it adequately would, and in a fair way, would demand coordination at a scale for which no precedent exists in the history of humankind. And there is no space for that, there's no seeming space or place at which that coordination can take place in the horizon. Contrary to what the paranoid deliriums of the far right say, we're not approaching a global government, let alone a federation of freely associated producers anytime soon. So, you know, it's unclear where that coordination could come from, or which agencies, which instances could bring it about. On the other hand, the large-scale coordination, the forms of large-scale coordination that do exist nowadays, namely competition among nation states in the international system of nation states, and the competition among different capitals in the global market. These forms of large-scale coordination are not only insufficient, are not only inadequate to the problem, they are in fact responsible for the problem and for our incapacity to solve them, to the extent that is precisely the search for competitive advantages in those two spheres of competition among capitals in the global market, competition among nation states in the international system. It's precisely that search for advantage, for competitive advantage, that ensures that we continue to invest in those things that offer a more immediate financial return, even if those things are precisely the things that move us farther and farther away from a safe operating space for life in this planet. In the face of this, in the face of the fact that the spheres of coordination that do exist today are not only inadequate, but are actually responsible for the problem in the first place and for entrenching the problem evermore. In the face of that, it is normal, or it is at the very least comprehensible, that we would react by placing our bets on the small scale, whether that be the scale of individual consumer choices. Everyone has to do their bit for climate change, or to help fight climate change. Be it the scale of local and regional communities. it's when I say this is comprehensible and to some extent justified, it is justified by precisely the distrust in any notion of global coordination, given the fact that it was precisely the globalization of the capitalist market and the system of nation states that produced the problem. And on the other hand, large-scale planning initiatives, though the historical experiences that we have of large-scale planning initiatives, such as those attempted in the Soviet system, often tended to impose themselves violently upon local realities. But this takes us to the second point in my talk, which concerns the need to think about capitalism in terms of scale and to think scale in ecological terms. In order to think scale in ecological terms, I'm turning now to a branch of physics and ecology that's known as hierarchy theory. Hierarchy theory basically conceives of physical and biological reality as a hierarchy of levels of organization in which something that counts as a system at one level counts as an element of another system at a higher level of organization. So, for example, the atom, the molecule, the cell, the tissue, the organ, the organism, population. As you go up, you have things that on the one hand are systems composed of lower order elements, but also elements in a higher order system. The second principle of hierarchy theory is that these hierarchical levels not only constitute levels of successive integration, but they must also be understood as levels of constraint and conditioning. In other words, higher levels impose constraints upon the liberty of lower levels, of the elements, of the lower level elements that compose those higher level systems. They do not determine what elements at the lower levels do, but they impose limits on what those elements can do, and they exercise a causal the measure of the constraint that a hierarchical level can exercise on a lower level should be understood as the product of two factors. The first one being amplitude, i.e. the quantity of signs or of action that the lower level receives from the higher level. And the other being the asymmetry between the two levels, which results from the difference in cycles between the higher and the lower levels. The duration of a higher level, and therefore the cyclical nature of its relevant events, is higher than the duration and the cycles of a lower level system, which implies that while a lower level system could exist for its entire duration within a particular phase of a higher level, and the fluctuations of the higher level have a very high probability of imposing limits or giving new freedoms to the elements at the lower level. The fluctuations at the lower level have a relatively limited capacity to influence the behavior of the higher level. So, you know, let's say here, capitalism, or let's avoid capitalism for the time being. Western civilization is a higher order system. My own life takes place. You know, my own life is a blip within the duration of this higher order. Therefore, the influence that the higher order has on my life is much larger than the influence that I might have on it. Doesn't mean that I have no influence, but it means that, you know, in normal conditions, its influence on my life, which takes place entirely within it, will be much larger than any influence that I can have back on it. Why am I talking? I realize that what time did we start? We started 10 minutes late?
Somewhere.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll skip a couple of things to try and make it fit. I'm also just so you know, I have a text in Portuguese in front of me, so I'm translating live as I speak. So this is also slowing me down a little bit. So why am I talking about this? To talk about capitalism. Why am I talking about hierarchy theory? First of all, because I think this vocabulary of levels of conditioning and constraint offer us a different way of talking about capitalism that avoids a certain naive empiricism that would claim that, well, since capitalism isn't anything we can point our finger to, then it does not exist, but also a tendency which we find, for example, in what's the name of it? In actor network theory, to say that capitalism can just be decomposed into the networks presently existing that sustain its existence, and therefore, like everything else, like, you know, my life, capitalism would be just as fragile because it's just dependent on the continuity of those networks, like everything else. What I mean by this turn to hierarchy theory is that capitalism doesn't exist exclusively as a global articulation of an ensemble of networks and of global networks and connections. It also exists as a set of constraints that establish a certain choice structure, a certain path dependency for the behavior of the elements existing within it, or at the very least, paths of least resistance for those local connections. In other words, capitalism does not determine what anyone does, but it makes some results, or it makes some events far more likely and possible than others, and some a lot more likely, a lot more probable than others. Let's take two constraints operating at different levels of necessity for capitalism. on the one hand, one constraint operating at a very high level for capitalism, because it's fundamentally what defines capitalism, which is the imperative of the self-valorization of capital. In other words, the fact that the final goal for capital is always the production of more capital. And on the other hand, the use of fossil fuel. What these two examples show is that systemic conditionings exist that exclusively local actions wouldn't be capable of solving in and of themselves, and that would therefore demand action at higher scales. So, for example, we could imagine 1 million sustainable communes emerging in the next few years all over the world. We can imagine several countries announcing that they are going to shift their energetic bases to renewable sources. If nothing is done to directly make the fossil fuel industry permanently unviable from the economic point of view, this would still not be enough to avoid a drastic raise in global temperatures by the end of the century. Of course, someone could always argue that nothing guarantees that these changes wouldn't be enough to cause the abandonment of oil, gas, and coal in the longer run, but this objection runs up against the other key aspect of the climate dilemma, which is its finite temporal dimension, i.e., we don't actually have that much time. What's even more than that, environmental catastrophe itself, to the extent that it takes place at a higher hierarchical level to that of our own individual lives or the lives of our communities, of the localities in which we live, implies the impossibility of purely local solutions for a global challenge. Even if those local solutions were successful in the short run, the tendency is that climate and social chaos that would follow would swallow them up in the medium to long term. And yet, often in debates about climate change or the Anthropocene, we see a very odd non sequitur that goes from starting by identifying a global problem, a problem that in a certain sense can only appear from a certain global level of abstraction. This is precisely why the argument of the far right is always to say, well, but how come there's climate change if today it's cold where I am? So it's a problem that demands a certain degree of abstraction to be even visible as the problem that it is. And the reason for that non sequitur, which I imagine many of you will recognize from your experience and debates that you have been in, the reason for that non sequitur, I would say, is precisely the three reasons, or the reasons for that non sequitur are precisely those three that I lined up before. First of all, the intractability of the problem. Secondly, the mistrust of any notion of global coordination, given that the spheres of global coordination that we have today are precisely what are entirely inadequate to the task and are what created the problem in the first place. And finally, the fact that large-scale planning initiatives have historically meant a violent imposition from above on local realities. So again, it's, my claim here is that it's understandable why people would react in that way, wouldn't want to talk about anything above a certain scale of action. It's perfectly understandable that they do that, but the fact that it's understandable doesn't make it any more wrong, or it doesn't make it any less wrong or any less problematic. As I argue in my book, in Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, there is in fact a great confusion around the concept of local. The local is always local in relation to a higher dimension, and it cannot be confused with any particular scale. So the Earth is local in relation to the solar system. The solar system is local in relation to the Milky Way, so on and so forth. The problem with the concept of local is precisely that it is a scale relative concept that people often treat as if it had an absolute meaning. So as a consequence, even though the frame of reference should change, according to whether we're talking about, a quarrel between neighbors, or changing national policy, or defeating a global industry like fossil fuel, or changing the world system, it seems that at the end of the day, to many people, the word local will always conjure the idea of garden allotments, or food co-ops, or neighborhood meetings. It's evident that given the absence of spaces where the kind of coordination and the level of coordination that is required for an adequate and fair solution to the climate crisis do not exist at a planetary level, it is evident that the only place in which we can act is local. But that doesn't mean that we should be restricted to that very small scale of neighborhood groups, or of local, or of neighborhood allotments. On the contrary, what we need is collective action at several different scales, in which it would be possible to act at several different scales in which it is possible to act, working in the direction of ever larger spheres of coordination that are capable of distributing in a fairer and more egalitarian way both the costs of the transition, not only towards a different energy regime, but also towards a different economic and political system, but also to distribute the impacts of the damage that we've already caused at this point. Correcting this imbalance in our political debate today means remembering that if the problem of organization is not defined by the need to constitute an absolute force, i.e., it's not trying to answer the question how to build a force that is more powerful than any other force, because that is impossible, it never ceases to involve, it never ceases to entail the constitution of a relative force, i.e., it never ceases to ask itself the question how to be powerful enough to produce effects at the appropriate scale to deal with whatever problem. And obviously the scale will change according to the problem we're dealing with. But we still need to ask ourselves how to, be it at the neighborhood level, be it at the national level, be it at the international level with an international industry such as fossil fuel. The question is still how to produce effects at the adequate scale in order to solve this problem. Now, this is the point at which I would veer into an analysis of the work of a thinker I imagine many of you are, or all of you are familiar with, the American anthropologist, Chinese American anthropologist Anna Tsing, and a critique of her critique of scalability and the ways in which I think her critique of scalability is supposing and reproducing precisely the position that I'm criticizing here, but that would definitely take me much over time. So I'll stop here, and hopefully we'll have the chance to pick up on that thread in the discussion afterwards. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo, for this very thought-provoking, insightful presentation, and I think brings a very important discussion to the questions related to the climate crisis, and one that I feel has not been adequately grappled with. And in the past years, we have seen in the work, for example, more recently and more famously, Andreas Malmer's How to Blow Up a Pipeline. I think there has been an attempt by both scholars and activists of trying to tackle more this issue of organization. And I think this is a really important contribution. If there's anyone out there in the audience who would like to pose a question, please raise your digital hands, or you can also write down in the chat. But while we wait, Rodrigo, maybe we could I would like to pick up on something that you mentioned right towards the end, about the producing effects at the adequate scale, and because I think that is such a crucial point when we talk about trying to fight back against those responsible for the climate crisis, and I would like you maybe to disentangle that a little bit more, so that we can understand better exactly what you're talking about, and how it can really inform our actions in the real world.
Well, thank you, Bernardo, for the question. I mean, obviously, a concrete answer to that question is always depending on us first specifying what is the problem and what is the scale. But it is basically, my point here is it's one thing to deal. We were just talking about this in relation to Berlin. It's one thing to deal with the problems that tenants are facing in one housing, or the problems that tenants are facing with housing in one part of town, and it's perfectly possible to do that, and it's perfectly possible if you manage to get sufficient leverage among the people who are affected, and then you manage to use that leverage to put pressure on the on whoever is in charge of the buildings that people are living in, or whoever is in charge in the local authority to respond to the things that people are demanding. It's you have defined a level for your, or let's say a level of action for your target. We're going to we're going to try to solve these problems in this neighborhood. That automatically gives you some idea of what your universe is. So what the universe is that you're organizing within. How many people are involved in this, i.e., how many people are suffering directly from this problem? How many other people belong to the community and know the people who are suffering this problem but aren't directly affected by it? That gives you some idea of, okay, this is the total universe of people that we need to mobilize. Say if you're talking about a single building, a single tower block, we need at least the majority of the people in this tower block on the side of this campaign. And that's great. And it's great if it works. But it's not going to solve the problem of housing in Berlin. The problem of housing in Berlin will force you to go one level or a few levels up. It will force you to put pressure on the local government to change local legislation. It might force you to put pressure, to start a campaign to put pressure on at the federal level to bring new forms of taxation upon commercial landlords, etc., etc. And it's the same thing with fossil fuel. Now, obviously, there is no, you're not going to solve the problem of the fossil fuel industry by petitioning the UN, because there's absolutely nothing that the UN can do. So to act at the adequate level doesn't mean acting at doesn't mean acting at an immediately global level, because the immediately global level doesn't exist. But it means that in all likelihood, it means you're going to have to combine campaigns of directly blocking the expansion of fossil fuel extraction, or the moving of fossil fuel from one place to another, i.e., preventing pipelines from being built, to make it commercially unviable to continue to use existing pipelines or to continue to extract fossil fuels in certain areas. And that can be done by direct action. That can be done, by campaigning for local governments to bring in new forms of taxation, or committing to reducing extraction over time, etc., etc. And finally, it will involve, in all likelihood, it will have to involve, especially considering the time we have available, it will have to involve the action of nation states, of national governments, to produce both negative and positive incentives. Negative in the sense that it's making the fossil fuel industry less viable economically, and positive in the sense that it's also redirecting investment away from fossil fuel industries, evidently by making other areas more enticing commercially, or more enticing financially for investors. So those would be some of the examples here. But obviously, in order to make governments do that, then you're going to need to organize at a level which is much bigger than just your local building or your local tower block or even your local neighborhood.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Mira, I saw that you had your hand raised up, and then we'll go to Cecilia. But first, Mira was there first.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well. Thank you.
Okay, good. For me, it's not yet clear for who are the people that are specifying the problem and the adequate scale, outside of the people who are maybe organizing locally and who are maybe activists and raising problems, but who are really also the people who are working legitimately, officially on these adequate scales, and who has the power to specify that. Because I do already, for example, see that there are many debates that we're locked into because of the structure that we have that is built for this problem and the solving these problems. But there are so many different and diverse approaches to things, but they don't really get raised or worked on and get to a further state, because they are not what people are really made to do, or what the structure what they're working in is making it possible to work on. So my question would be, who is officially and legitimately specifying these problems and scales?
I think there are two separate questions there. On the one hand, there's a question of fact and there's a question of right. The question of fact is some things about determine the scale. I think that okay, let's start with one thing that I skipped in my presentation of hierarchy theory, which is hierarchy theory. One of the principle of hierarchy theory that I skipped is precisely the idea that the differentiation of levels or the differentiation of scales is always relative to an observer. So you know, when I spoke of atoms, molecules, tissues, organs, organisms, populations, that is just one way of cutting reality up into different levels. So, and this is a theoretical point that I think is a political point as well. Like, these distinctions are always distinctions made by an observer. So this answers the question of right. Who should be entitled? Who makes those distinctions? Well, whoever, anyone makes those distinctions. Obviously, it's one thing for me to make those distinctions at home on my own that has a certain causal efficiency, that has a certain impact on the world, and for a large mass movement to make those distinctions and act upon them, which tends to have a much greater impact on the world than anything that I ever could do. So if the question is who gets to make those calls, the answer is whoever, and who gets to make those calls and act upon them. Well, whoever is in a position to act upon them. On the other hand, the fact that you could cut reality up in all sorts of different ways doesn't mean, so the fact that, you know, those levels or scales are always relative to an observer does not mean that they are arbitrary. They would only be arbitrary if you were identifying relationships where relationships do not exist. So there is also some sense in which those things are objective, in the sense that, you know, if you try to petition a government with, let's go back to my example of the tower block. You have a tower block where 200 families live. So let's say 800 people. In order to do something in that building, for you to have 500 people on board may be enough. For you to make your federal government do something, 500 people will probably not be enough, unless those 500 people have chosen their target very, very well. They have chosen a point of leverage that's very powerful, and that helps them put pressure on their government. But if you're doing a petition with 500 signatures in a universe of 800 people, that's one thing. If you're doing a petition with 500 signatures in a universe of millions, billions of people, that will not get you anywhere. So, you know, in that sense, scale is also an objective reality. Now, the other question is, well, who gets to make those calls except people who are acting locally? And the point that maybe I went through this too quickly, but one of the points here is precisely that action is always local. What I'm arguing against is not that. People always organize locally, and to some extent, people always act locally. What I'm arguing against is not, and people would often like to act at a bigger scale that they can do now, but they simply don't have the capacity. They don't have the resources. They don't have they don't have the resources to organize beyond the capacity at which they are acting today. What I'm arguing against, and this would probably have been clearer if I'd managed to get to the second part, where I was discussing the work of Anat Singh, is not anything that movements are doing today, but it's a tendency for intellectuals, for scholars to come up with arguments that minimize the role of, or worse than minimize, demonize the role of scale in politics. So I'm not actually arguing against what movements are doing. I think most movements would like to be acting at a higher scale than they are acting today, but they just don't have the resources for that. What I was arguing against is more of an intellectual tendency to minimize or demonize the problem of scale.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Cecilia, sorry, Mira, you have a follow-up question?
No, it's okay. I just wanted to say thank you, and maybe also say something to that, but maybe first the other question, because I don't know how much time there is.
No, we have 20 minutes, so you can follow up, and then Cecilia, also had her hand raised. She can then
Okay.
after you.
Yes, okay. Yes, I also do think it's very important to give the notions of scale credit and to respect their role in everything. And at the same time, I'm wondering about some of the conflicts that arise, because in some notions there are scales where maybe local action is the most effective, but they don't get really the freedom and the resources and the capacities. Maybe people who are paid to do this work and take it serious, because the power lies in structures that sort of hold the power, and where the distribution of work and of actions is concentrated. And I think that was also maybe a little bit what I had in thought when I asked you the question, because I sometimes see people who are only able to act on these effective scales because they say they either have the privilege, or because they say, I'm not going to be part of this state, the nation state, because I'm otherwise not really able to have this action, and that's the most important thing for me and the local people around me. So I'm wondering a bit if there's not in the end some friction and conflicts arising. Yes, that's all what I wanted to say. Thank you.
I was wondering if I'm not entirely sure that I follow. I was wondering if you could give an example that would make this more
yes.
concrete.
So, for example, people on a local scale that are maybe affected by environmental issues that they can't decide upon so much, and they don't hold the power. And it would be most effective in that case for people to have this power to decide for themselves about their local environments, but they don't have that power, and it's concentrated maybe on a nation level or something like that. And there's no one really that is paid on a local level to really also engage with this problem, and who is taken then maybe serious and is legitimately taking these issues important, dealing with it. And it also, I feel this concept also must include the distribution of power and decision making in some other forms. And I don't see that so much happening yet.
Right. I think I understand your point better now. I mean, again, like, you know, what I'm doing is not, if a group or you know, if an indigenous group or a local community is directly impacted by an extractive project happening in the vicinity of where they live, and they resist that project locally, that is absolutely what they have to do. You know, I'm not. It would be. I would like to think no one would actually try to argue against that. And obviously they would often want to. And they often, those groups often do understand that they need to act beyond that there will only be, put it that way, that they would only be safe for good from the expansion of the extractive frontier and the challenge that the threat that poses to them. They know fully well that they would only be safe if they could act at a higher level, i.e., if they could act, you know, to say change legislation, or if they could act to, or if they could act to, you know, prevent the expansion of the fossil fuel industry on a global scale. I'm not arguing against people doing what they can or what they need to do in extreme situations. Absolutely. What I am arguing against is, you know, that example is precisely the kind of example that I would use to talk about capitalism as a form of hierarchical conditioning. You can resist this project. One actual example, the Belo Monte Dam in Brazil that was built under PT. That's actually a project that dates back to the late 70s. And it was resisted in the 80s by local populations, primarily indigenous populations in the region. And thanks to that resistance and the debt crisis that Brazil, the debt and hyperinflation crisis that Brazil was in at the time, that project became commercially unviable. Now, several years later, under a left-wing government, that project came back, and the dam was built. Now, that is, I think, a very good example of the fact that, you know, to truly solve that problem, of the fact that to truly solve that problem, local resistance wasn't enough, because there were higher levels of hierarchical conditioning that eventually, even in a left-leaning PT government, ended up surpassing the capacity for local movements to and groups to resist, and eventually led to the building of the dam. Does that mean that I'm blaming the local resistance for not realizing that? No, absolutely not. I mean, they were doing what they could in you know, the situation, the conditions that they had, and I'm sure all of them understood that the problem was at a much higher scale. Against what I'm arguing against is a tendency to fetishize the local resistance and limit the fact, to mistake the fact that you can only act locally for a very different, and I would say misguided idea that the only level at which you should act, or the only level at which one can act, would be the local. I don't know if that addresses your point. Maybe I still didn't quite understand it, but, you know, just wanted to clarify that.
Bernard, you are muted. Bernard, should I pose the question? Because you cannot hear you. You were muted. You are still.
Sorry, thank you. Yeah, I was asking you to go ahead and ask the question,
Okay.
Cecilia. Thank you.
Okay, because I know time is short. So
Yeah,
thank you so much for this so wonderful talk. And I think my question, Rodrigo, it's maybe a little bit asking help of my friends, because one of the elements that we work together, Bernard and I, Alexandra also it's here online, is the idea of how then to think about politics when Earth is at the center of politics. And of course, these affect the scales And I'm curious to know a little bit if in your work you have addressed, or it's an element also that you reflect on, about the idea of the planetary, and how then we can think about how that affect the act of governing, and how would it be then to think about scale and this idea of the planetary.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Cecilia, for that question. This is actually one of we were talking earlier about the fact that this is what I was presenting today was a work in progress, and this is actually one of the directions where it has to go next. Like trying to define. At the moment, I think I'm using terms like global and planetary a little too loosely, and those aren't actually terms that I have on which I have reflected sufficiently to actually understand what are the distinctions that I need for the point that I'm trying to make, and then to actually make those distinctions. I've seen a few ways of distinguishing those terms, and I have to say I wasn't entirely convinced by any of the ones I've seen. But then again, maybe they were just designed to deal with different problems, which weren't the problems that I was dealing with, and therefore the differences that they proposed didn't make a difference to me, which is obviously not a problem of the concepts themselves, but a problem, that purely again a perspectival problem. The distinctions are distinctions made by an observer. So yeah, at this moment, I don't think I would have anything more precise to say about that than this. I don't know if you were thinking of a particular follow-up with, like, if you could see something in my talk for which you would have a follow-up.
Yeah, no, because one thing that interested me about these scales, and when we connected with ideas like, for example, different mechanisms that connects the global with this idea of the planet, and the local, like with the Agenda 21, then afterwards with the Millennium Development Goals, the SDGs, and right now, like the implementation of the Paris Agreement, there is always this kind of direction of creating models of implementing a maybe planetary agenda. Now the word is planetary, I think, because I think until Agenda 21 and the Millennium Development Goals, I think these international agendas were more towards the ideas of how to reduce poverty, how to complement development agendas. But since the emergence of a climate change regime, I think we have these different modes of governing towards the planetary that also tries to adapt a little bit the scales of this implementation of these agendas. So then while I was listening to you, I was thinking a little bit and wondering if you were also kind of reflecting or trying to maybe next step on your work, dealing more with this idea of direct action or activism, or the impact of capitalism and climate change, if that would be something already that you are thinking about. But if not, you are invited, of course, to come along here at the Rives in the Potsdam, and it would be great to keep the conversation rolling.
No, that is definitely the direction that is of interest to me. Also because, at the end of the day, cynical, but I don't think absolutely unfounded belief is that all these negotiations will, without organized political action, without collective agency at the appropriate scales and using the appropriate leverage, because I think it's important always to remember that when we talk about acting at the appropriate scale, we're not simply talking about matching numbers. You know, it may have sounded like it when I said, well, if you get a petition to the local government, you're going to need this many people. But if you get a petition to the federal government, you're going to need this many people. It's not just that. It's also finding the leverage points that allow you to make the most of the agency that you have. But the problem is, the higher the level at which you're trying to act, probably also the more numbers and organization and capacity to act, etc., you're going to need to in order to find the appropriate leverage points and to exploit them. But yeah, like basically my cynical, but I think not absolutely unfounded belief is that without collective agency at the appropriate scales, that those negotiations and those agreements and everything these processes between nation states come up with, or among nation states come up with, will be dead letter, and all the more dead because we'll be dead as well.
Yeah, we have a
Bernard, you are muted again.
Sorry. Thank you, Cecilia. I'm dealing here with two things to unmute, but I was just reading Alexandra Toast, my colleague. She commented here in the chat regarding this topic. It could be interesting in that sense to compare the Belo Monte experience with the successful protest against the hydroaizin mega dam project in Chilean Patagonia, which was initiated by local initiatives. So there is that, Rodrigo. We do have one question. We only have two more minutes in the chat, Rodrigo. I will read it for you, and then you can, like, in 2 minutes address it. It's from Diego Viana from São Paulo. He writes, in a capitalist economy, scale is linked to what microeconomics calls, microeconomists, I think, calls economies of scale. That is the capacity to raise enormously the yield investment ratio through sheer growth, roughly put. To me, this has always seemed like a serious barrier to scaling local action, as it embeds a tendency towards oligopoly that comes with entry barriers and other powers. Could this be bypassed? So in 1-2 minutes, if you can address Diego's question, please.
Well, that would have been precisely the direction in which the discussion of Anat Singh's work would have taken us, in the sense that what Anat Singh comes to understand as scalability is ultimately scalability in precisely that sense, is scalability in the sense of economies of scale, and it is in that, and obviously, that's she is very explicit about that being the problem, that being what caused the problem in the first case, her favorite example to explain that is actually pre-industrial is the plantation system. And she sees, in that sense, she sees Fordism as a directly continuation of the plantation system in the sense that they all involve scalability, in this sense of in the sense of something that tends both to homogenization and to and that has this inbuilt oligopolistic tendency that's embedded in economies of scale. But the problem is that she herself provides, before she comes up with the concept of scalability, she herself provides other ways of thinking about gains in scale that do not involve what she calls scalability. And I think this shift in her thought, the fact that she comes to understand gains in scale as involving scalability in that sense, and she comes to understand whatever does not involve scalability, or whatever does not exclusively involve scalability, as not implying gains of scale, is a serious limitation, both to her understanding of capitalism. I think this leads her down some really absurd theoretical dead ends in her interpretation of capitalism, but also is a problem for how we think about collective action at scale, because it precisely reduces collective action at scale to, or it by reducing gains in scale to scalability, to economies of scale, as Diego described them, she ends up making the gains of scale in politics, or that she ends up making collective action at scale tarnished by the same problems. And what I wanted to argue precisely was that what she calls scalability, what supposes economies of scale as described by Diego, is not the only way for us to think about collective action at scale. And I think it's the other ways that we have to think about those things that are more interesting. But maybe this will have to wait until I come back with the full article, and then I can start from that section instead of leaving it out of the discussion.
Well, thank you.
Bernardo, você tá mudo de novo, Bernardo. Desculpa interferir.
Thank you, Cecilia. It's been, I have to mute and unmute twice. I was just saying, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rodrigo, for this insightful, for your insightful contribution here to our ongoing conversation about justice in sustainability. We look very much forward to seeing where this is going to lead, and to reading your work. Thank you everyone who has joined us today. Please take a look at our website on the chat for more information. Our next event, for those of you, will be in person only. For those of you who are in the Berlin-Potsdam area, we invite you to the workshop of the RIF's focal topic year 2023, Justice and Sustainability, Rethinking Freedom, Justice and Democracy in an Age of Climate Change. You can find more information in the link here in the chat, and you can join us to discuss some of the issues related to the climate crisis in the run-up to the COP conference. So thank you, everyone, and yeah, see you next time. Bye, and thank you, Rodrigo, for being here with us today. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.